welcome to the session on author with her authors, meet the critics. They're all right here. The author is Isabelle Ferreras from Louvain, and she is representing her co-authors, Julie Battilana and Dominique Méda. And amongst the critiques, we have Dalia, Gesualdi-Fecteau from Université de Québec, Montreal. We have Lukas Lehner from Oxford University. We have Anke Hassel, and excuse me, I'm just going to get the institution right. Excuse me, it's on the other page. So at the Hertie School, which is in what city? Berlin. Okay. And we have our emeritus professor, David Peetz from Griffith University in Australia. So thank you very much all for participating in this great session. And we're going to start a little interactively by saying, okay, Isabelle, what moved you to do this volume? And I know that you're going to talk about the history of the volume, but just tell us what moved you, and you can take this.
Maybe this? Yes.
Is it working?
Hello, I'm just standing because I would like to see everyone. No, it's not. Yeah, this is working better, maybe. Okay, hello everyone. It's very nice to see you all, some friendly faces and some other new faces. I'm delighted to be here. What pushed us to produce this book? Probably some of you already know about what propelled us to do this book is that during the first lockdown, as scholars working on work, on labor, we really felt that we had to try to tell societies what they could, what they should learn maybe from that moment of reckoning. Everybody was applauding the essential workers, and yet actually our economy is organized on the very opposite principle that workers are absolutely non-essential, that they have no say in the economy, that they are basically commodities exchanged on the labor market. So we felt we had a responsibility because we have some knowledge to share, maybe, and that led us to write an op-ed which was so undersigned by some of you that we felt that we had to continue to nurture the conversation, and we wrote this book to nurture the conversation. I'm happy to say that this week the book came out in Italian, and originally it was written in French, but it is a somewhat augmented version because we really tailored it for the English-speaking audience.
And just what was the revelatory moment where you said, we need to write a manifesto? Time, place, diet, circumstance.
Well, we never thought we would write a manifesto. We just, I was discussing these ideas with Julie Battilana and Dominique Méda for many times prior to the pandemic, obviously. But then during this first lockdown, I really told them, okay, let's try to do something for May Day. Because, you know, the May Day 2020 was during the first lockdown in Belgium, in France, in Boston, and in so many other places. And so when May the 1st arrived, I had not sent a draft to my co-authors. And so I told my husband, okay, I'm not going to do it, to do this. This is, you know, we were all overwhelmed with so much work, working remotely and all that. And I will always, in my life, remember the gaze. He looked at me like, what are you doing? You're not going to write that op-ed? And I felt really...
supported? Really supported?
Well, yes. Somehow, and I felt, okay, this is probably something we have to do, even though we thought it would only be an op-ed for Le Monde, but then eventually, indeed, it was an important op-ed.
Thank you, Isabelle. And we pass it over to David Peetz, who, of course, he's not forewarned of any of these questions. When did you first get a glimpse of the manifesto, and what did it say to you?
I have no idea when I had a first glimpse of the manifesto, but it would have been, oh, no, I do have some idea. It was sometime around about May of 2020, you know, to be approximate. And what did it say to me? It said to me a whole lot of great stuff, actually. That these are a group of people who are writing about economic democracy, the need for democracy at work, and yeah, that I think is something that we really need to pay more attention to, and it really caught my attention.
Okay, thank you. And Anke, same question in the sense, when did you first get hold of, or perhaps you were a signatory of the manifesto?
No, I wasn't. I was asked to sign. I didn't sign, and I made the statement that I wouldn't sign. And I remember that when it came out, it also came out in a German weekly paper. And Lisa Herzog was the sort of main activist on that. And then we were asked to discuss the manifesto on a radio show, German NPR radio show. And we had a heated debate about it.
So things are heating up here. Am I right?
Maybe. We'll
okay.
See. No, since then I sort of, I calmed down a bit about it, but we can discuss it.
Great. No, and absolutely. There's every reason to discuss. And over to you, Lukas. When did you come across the manifesto, and what did it say to you?
So I was a bit late to the game, it seems. I learned about the manifesto in the way, just about over a year ago, in the wake of when you announced the conference that you would organize, and when I realized that this manifesto would actually be more than a manifesto, and the book is more than a book. It would translate into attempt to build a movement, and that has been building since. And so I was excited about the conference and joined this conference in fall 2021, and many scholars, but also activists and policymakers came together online around the world and discussed about democratizing work.
Okay, thank you. And same question to Dalia.
I think I signed the manifesto. I can't remember when, but I think when it first circulated.
And this is a pyramid scheme, right?
It is. So for me, in the first days of the lockdown in Quebec, I got a lot of media calls to try to see and understand what should we do? What can labor law do? Because I'm a labor lawyer, and what are the holes? What are the gaps? What can we do? And I felt, as a scholar, then seeing what was happening in health facilities, extremely, powerlessness inside. And I think for me, the manifesto kind of captioned in a very accessible way, and that's what I really appreciated. And we can talk about some issues after, but really appreciated the way when we're trying to say what the problem is and how. I think, and that's what I want to talk about after, but I think the manifesto provides a basis to think about the roadmap to go further and how to democratize and how to decommodify and how to decarbonize. So, thank you.
And if I understand correctly, Isabelle, and we're not talking about the manifesto today, at least not directly, we are talking about this book, which is Democratize Work, the case for reorganizing the economy, but I'm perhaps not wrong in thinking that this is the offspring of the manifesto and the book that the manifesto gave rise to. So I think it's best if we start off by asking you to introduce this newly published book and to explain a bit, and then we'll move back over to Dalia and across the way to get everyone's comments on their reading of the book. So thank you.
Thank you, Gregor. Okay, this is working, right? Thank you so much. Yes, I'm going to give you a quick overview at the book. The connection between all this is that indeed it started with this manifesto, op-ed turned manifesto, in the way that because we felt there was so much interest into the manifesto, we felt we had a responsibility to basically give us the space to disentangle the three principles and what's captured in the manifesto, which is way too short, which is obviously non-academic. And so we indeed organized a global forum on democratizing work that was last fall to, during 3 days, discuss the three principles. And it was very encouraging indeed, because we were more than 3,000 scholars and activists from around the world discussing the principles, and the manifesto as it is has been translated in 27 languages. I would like to point to one aspect, which is not, we do not make a big statement about it, but when you read the book, or when you see who is organizing this movement, you will see that it is actually led by female scholars. We felt it was very important. Why? Because in that very moment of the first pandemic, we could all see that the condition of women across the globe would get only worse. And we felt a responsibility as female scholars, having the possibility to step in and voice an analysis about what was going on. We really made a decision to do that, pushing forward female scholars. And we have been all the way through very grateful to our male colleagues who understood this, who signed the op-ed, who circulated it, who got engaged with setting up the global forum, and but we have so far really be keen on continuing to put female scholars forward, because we know that the conditions of women around the world is deteriorating. So it's very important to us. Now, the book, as I just said, it is out, was out last month in English. A very nice point is that 60 years ago, actually, the University of Chicago Press released Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, and we felt very energized that the University of Chicago felt that 60 years after, they had to publish Democratize work, not written by one man, but by 13 female authors. Because in the book, indeed, there is a chapter written by 13 female authors who come from around the globe and who have an expertise connected to the content of the manifesto. And so each chapter is devoted to give some more background explanation about the various dimensions of the manifesto. What I'm going to do is to give you a very quick overview about the content. So our starting point is really the starting point of the Declaration of Philadelphia, if you want, the idea that labor is not a commodity. And yet, what we know is that our economy is organized totally contrary to that idea. Workers are treated as human, at best, resources. And what we say in the op-ed is that we ensure the dignity of all citizens, and by that we mean not only recognized citizens from our states, but racialized communities, migrants, workers in the working in the informal economy here in the north, but also in the global south, as in India. Neeraj and Doki has a chapter on that. While we connect this issue with marshalling the collective strength and effort that we need to preserve our life together on this planet. And so to ensure that, we should basically strive to connect and put into practice three principles: to decommodify labor, but not labor only, democratize firms, so that indeed we can decarbonize the planet. Decommodify labor, the idea is to recognize that we should decommodify many aspects of our life. Obviously, it was clear from the experience of the pandemic that the so-called so-called free market is not going to care for our needs. We should, when it comes, so we can think about health, of course, education, but when it comes to labor, indeed, it's not the labor market which is taking care of the dignity of the people. And to think that a market is actually the suitable institution to allocate human resources, it's actually a very dramatic conception, actually. And so one way to do this, to decommodify labor, this is a quote from the op-ed, is with the creation of a job guarantee. A job guarantee would enact the Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the idea that people should have the right to the free choice of employment, and a job guarantee would be a way to organize the fact that people do have a job that is dignified, that would pursue certain needs not covered by the market, especially when it comes to climate change. We know that there are many positions that need to be created that are going to care for the needs of the planet, but no consumer will ever want to pay for that. And that will be critical in the coming years. Our work of reference here is the work done by Pavlina Cherneva, who's one of our 13 authors, who has been working on this proposal for 15 years now, and we are looking at current experimentation underway. Lukas will certainly speak to that because he's an expert on the Austrian experimentation currently going on. We are looking at what's going on in France with the experimentation Territoire Zéro Chômeur de Longue Durée, basically zero long-term unemployment territory. The idea is to build up at a very small scale communities of 8,000 people to identify the needs that are not covered either by the public powers or by the private firms, and to build positions with the unemployed people who want to have a meaningful job. And this is actually very successful in France now. For 5 years, they have developed now more than 25 such territories. And in Belgium, the Walloon government has decided to allocate 100 million euros to develop this experimentation. So there are lots of interesting experimentation going on at the moment, which could give, if you want, the coordinates of what a jobs guarantee at a large scale could look like, being publicly funded by the federal state or by the European Union, but which would be locally administrated and implemented with true participatory schemes. Democratize firms. Here the idea is to recognize that a personal investment of labor that is of one's mind, one's body, one's very own life ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm. This obviously comes from what we have, well, we thought we have recognized during this pandemic, is that especially the essential workers, they are putting their very own life in the balance. And yet they have no right to collectively bear on the decisions of the firm. And that is totally wrong. That is... I'm aware that the time is fleeing, so can I still have 4 minutes? Yes? So when you hear the business discourse today, it's all about shareholder capitalism and the idea that, you know, the companies are looking for their, stakeholders, not just their shareholders, but their stakeholders. And by stakeholders, they mean the consumers, the communities affected, the employees, etc. And this op-ed really takes a very different footing. The idea is that actually there are one core constituency, which is made of those who invest their labor into the work endeavor, which is not only affected as a stakeholder community, but which is actually governed by the rules and decisions of the firm. And these are all the people who work, who are not necessarily recognized in a contractually, labor contract standards employment relation with the firm, and yet they are governed by the decisions of the firm. This is why I think it's helpful to call them labor investors. They invest what's most important to them, it's their life, and yet those who actually have the right to bear on the government of the firm are those who just bring in money, which is a very different nature than investing your own life. So the collective right to validate or veto the decisions of the firm is actually a very old principle, which comes from the history of political democracy, which is the right that has been recognized when we managed to get out of the despotism of property owning minority governing a political entity. And this is very much the situation actually of firms today. In most of the countries, firms are run by what you could see as House of Lords. The board of a government is the ones represented are those who own the shares in the corporation, as the House of Lords was the representation of those who own the land. But those who invest their life have no right whatsoever. It builds up on what we know. German co-determination, this is a quick zoom on German determination. You have the board, which is made of half representatives of the labor side, half representatives of the capital side. But what the German legal scholars call fausse parity is that the president of the board is from the capital side and can also cast a vote. So this is not enough to grant collective ability to validate or veto the decisions, but that's very important because in history it really is the large-scale experimentation that shows that there are two constituencies in the capitalist firm, those who bring in capital and those who are investing labor. So the op-ed basically says that we should do more. And actually, there is one exception in the German history which is exactly doing that, which is called Mitbestimmung, which is the original version of Mitbestimmung, in which, for the appointment of the director of labor relations, the college of voters made of the representatives of workers had to find a majority within itself to validate the appointment. So it's strict parity with this idea of a veto power. In the book, there is a chapter by Sarah Lafuente on this. So the role of unions here is absolutely key. They are the ones who are capable to ensure that democratizing the firm will be the opportunity to nurture solidarity across firm, across industries, and only unions can do that. But we don't need a European-style industrial relations to do that neither. We could imagine developing that in the US with what we call dual majority board, which is here a paper that I refer to with Julie Battilana, and that could be a way to foster a union, foster the presence of unions in the US in a dramatic way, obviously. Not going to talk about it. The regulative ideal here, and we mentioned that at the end of the op-ed, it's these prefigurative practices that we know today. Cooperative firms, they exist, worker-owned and governed firms. They have actually existed so long as capitalism exists, yet they have not been in a position to really take, to extend to the whole economy. And that's the vision, is how we can democratize firms so that democratized firms become the most practiced, present type of firms in the in the economy. We can discuss the details later. Third principle, decarbonizing. This is also a quote from the manifesto. Basically, the idea is that if we want to decarbonize, if we want to fit the economy within the planetary boundaries, we need to understand that we have to get out of the extractive corporate governance model that we know today. It's not going to produce something else than what it is meant to produce, which is more extraction. So to put a break on this extractive logic, we need to bring in the constituency of labor investors with this collectively veto right. But let me also just give you one figure which I find so striking. It's the fact that this is coming from the research from the University of Cambridge engineers. They show that basically 3/4 of the global energy consumption could be saved. We have the technology. What we only need is more labor power. So if we continue with an economy that do not give power to labor, it's very clear that we are not going to be able to fit our economy within planetary boundaries. And so there are encouraging developments underway. We can talk about that during the discussion. But just to finish on the very idea is to say that these three principles are not new principles. We have not invented anything yet here with these three principles. What we say is that we have to connect them, to take them together, to move them forward together, because they are necessary. Each and the other are necessary, complementary, if we want to build an economy that really is sustainable and democratic. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Isabelle for that succinct and very interesting presentation. Can I remind everyone that we are here in a Network K, Author Meets Critics, and it's about experimentation in the regulation of work and employment. So you'll see the link both with the previous session we organized around revaluing workers and this one as well. And we're discussing democratized work, the case for reorganizing the economy. And I want to remind everyone that we're live streaming, even though you might not see it. So there might be some people watching from a distance, and the presenters here have agreed to this live streaming, but everyone should know that consent has been given there. And if you don't want to speak in that way, then you should know that in advance. It was a suggestion of SASE trying to make itself more open and more accessible. I'm sure there's a World Wide Web watching this, but I'm not sure who it is exactly. Maybe Dominique is there. Hi, Dominique. We've asked, and it was organized a little bit haphazardly at the last minute. So we said to people, you can speak to the book as a whole, or you can speak only to the punctuation in the book, whatever you want. But we'll start with Dalia. We gave each person 8 to 10 minutes. If they take 5, that's fine. If they take 20 minutes, that's not fine. So over to you, Dalia Gesualdi-Fecteau from Université de Québec à Montréal.
Okay, thank you very much, Gregor. Thank you, Isabelle, also for giving me the possibility of sharing a couple of thoughts with you. So as Gregor said, this was organized at the last minute, so I will resort to my notes. I'm sorry about that. So I think that when I read the book at first, the first question that came to me is, so what are the preconditions that we have to think of, or that we have to reunite to avoid what Lisa Herzog really beautifully shown, to avoid additional epistemic injustices. So basically the basic question for me that this book kind of led me to is, who can actually deliberate and who has the right to have rights, to cite Hannah Arendt. So I'm going to just share with you 3 sets of observations that this book really, I fully agree with most of the content, but I have some issues and some questions about the way certain things are laid out. So I think that the book as a whole, for me, shows the importance of thinking beyond policy boundaries. So both in the very way these policies are set forth, but also in the way that different actors play a role in their implementation. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. For me, decarbonizing, what does this display, is the absolute necessity of thinking about environmental law, occupational health and safety policy, public health policy altogether, because they are often linked and right now dissociated from an integrated way of thinking of things. The second thing for me in terms of policy boundaries and how these policy boundaries are leading us to leaving out a lot of people to actually deliberate is the disconnection between immigration policy and labor law. Precarious migratory status, all we know, is a challenge for labor law to actually be effective. The third thing, and this draws on the idea of a job guarantee. So I think that we've had, of course, we all come from a specific institutional context, a specific national context. In Canada, we had different initiatives in the past 30 years that wanted to lead to the idea of a job guarantee for some groups of workers that were historically left out of the labor market. And this led to different workfare programs that had, in part, good ideas, building what we've called social economy, building community-based organizations where you had workers actually contributing to these organizations, and it was state-funded. So very interestingly, these state-funded initiatives had per objective to actually provide some public sector services, so specifically in the health sector. And what we've seen 25 years later, and this has been documented by my colleague, some of you know her, Louise Boivin, and I think it's important work that we have to think of when we think of designing job guarantee and designing policies and the state, the role of the state and the way the role of the workers is thought of. It's one thing to give the opportunity of workers to contribute and really design the kind of job they want, but it's another thing to actually have the resources that follow all along. And when there's public services that provided through this, it brought in Quebec at least, a further commodification of some groups of workers that were working there. So the idea of a job guarantee is a good idea. I think we have to multiply the experiments, but we have to think carefully of the design of what services are provided and who's funding and what is the midterm and long-term reflection on how these things are designed. So my second set of comment is largely inspired by Adèle Blaquette's chapter. So like me, Adèle is a labor lawyer, and I think she calls, and I think that we have to move this a little bit more radically reconceiving labor law in terms of challenging how labor law is not just inadequate, but actually fosters, and this is truly what I think, the invisibility of some groups of workers. So, and further, in my opinion, contributes to foster the commodification of some groups that compose with structural factors of vulnerability. I think, and I think others share this thought with me, that labor law urgently has to put work and not the employment contract at the center of its preoccupation, and that we have to re-articulate today the protective function of labor law with another function of labor law that we have put aside in our collective thinking, which labor law is a tool of regulating the economy. This seems, in my perspective, imperative to ensure that labor law becomes a tool and not an objective obstacle to democratize, decommodify work. My third set and last set of observations, I'm looking at my chair and I want to get grounded. Third and last set of observations build on several chapters of the book that spell out the importance of radically reconceiving the firm to allow the democratization of work. And for me, this again, coming from a labor lawyer, speaks to the importance of reconceiving and rethinking the normative assumptions behind what is a management right. This is a pivotal concept to understand how labor law was built and today enforced. The idea, and yesterday we had a session where this was discussed, the idea of employee ownership was severally discussed, commonly discussed in the past year. And we've had some extremely interesting developments in Quebec, in Indigenous communities. And I want to share this with you because I think we have to think, at least in settler colonial settings, about democratization, decommodification, decarbonization, but also about decolonization. So the idea of employee ownership here in several indigenous communities in Quebec, I have to say, where indigenous forestry workers really felt disappointed and left out by EDI policies that large forestry firms that were encouraged by the state to actually set forth these EDI policies were hired based on this basis. And they were really disappointed how things were really happening inside the firm, and decided, with the support of the state, this is extremely interesting, to launch local cooperatives linked to their communities. A study that's been conducted by one of my graduate students in Quebec, her name is Beatrice Vend, in a very landmark research, showed that the very structure of the cooperative has allowed three things that resonates completely with the three themes of the manifesto and that works around the book. It led to democratizations. Why? Because workers feel on an everyday basis the meaning of work because they have a say about how work is done and about their working conditions. It speaks a lot to decommodification also because their working conditions are tailored to their reality and their needs. Speaks to decarbonization. Why? Because they conceive the forest not only as a mean of economic subsistence, but also of where they live and how they live. And lastly, it speaks a lot about decolonization also, because they own their production means and decide how to use these production means. So I want to end this little comment. I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, Gregor, that in this specific case, and I think that's what we have to think of, leads to kind of think of what political philosopher Bruce Hackerman called a constitutional moment. So basically, how can workers engage in an extended and better informed process of coming to a new consensus? Thank you.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Dalia. And over to you, Luca. So Luca Lehner from Oxford University.
Great, so thanks so much for inviting me, Isabelle. I can recommend everyone first. This book is really worth reading. It's a fantastic book. I've really enjoyed it. And it's a fantastic book because of a couple of things that I want to outline first before I get to some more critical questions. First of all, because as Isabelle outlined, it links really the three Ds, right? It links the decommodification, democratization, and decarbonization together. And it links them in a way as it argues that decommodification and democratization need to be achieved in order as a consequence to achieve decarbonization. And it provides a concrete vision that is between a long-term utopia that we hear far too often about and between short-term policies that we often discuss very concretely about. And it lays out this mid-term vision of concrete goals that can be achieved, that are concrete enough, but also outline some vision. And it has an emphasis on urgency, that this needs to be achieved now and not only debated. And this is why this book is much more than a book. It is a movement, as you have outlined, Isabelle. So I recommend everyone reading the book and getting engaged with this movement. Now, I was invited as a critique, and this wasn't an easy job since it's a great book, but so impressive job. But I want to structure my critique around 3 points. Now, these 3 points are: can decommodification of work actually be achieved through a job guarantee? And I'm skeptical. A job guarantee can also be seen as an additional layer of a social safety net, not necessarily as a transformation of our economy, much more as an additional feature of our welfare state. And I will go more into depth in a moment. The second point is, can full democratization of work be achieved via workplace democracy alone? Now, you outline some features of workplace democracy, referring to the German model, but also going more beyond that. But I'm wondering, does it mean that we do not need to think about other forms of economic democracy at the meso and macro level? And lastly, if these 2 points that I just mentioned are the case, are the changes that you propose in the book actually ambitious enough to achieve decarbonization? Or is decarbonization actually more independent of the first and the second point, as we would wish to think? Now, the 3 themes in the book, decommodification, democratization, decarbonization, they are not equally paid emphasis to in the book. There is a strong focus on democracy as the title of the book, a bit less on decommodification, and substantially less on decarbonization, right? Which is perhaps seen as a consequence to follow from decarbonization and democratization. And Isabelle, you were so kind enough to send me the PDF in advance, so I could play around amateurishly with some computational text analysis. And that also confirms the impression from reading the book. Democratize and various versions of that word and phrasing appears about 4 times as often as decommodification and 10 times as often as decarbonization or other versions of that word. But perhaps that is intentional and reflects also the author's focus. But perhaps it also reflects the author's and even our panel's background in our expertise. Now, going a bit more into substance of the arguments, the book uses radical language to propose what seems to me can be seen as quite modest proposals. And perhaps that's my own background more in international organizations such as the OECD. I find myself usually on the opposite side of the argument, framing somewhat radical ideas in modest language, right? So that's also my take, therefore, on the job guarantee and on democratizing work. One could argue that 1 and 2, decommodification and democratizing work, were already largely, not fully, but largely achieved through the social democratic welfare state. And on the first point, on decommodifying work, a job guarantee provides a job, an outside option, to anyone on a voluntary basis. But I'm wondering, what if such a job guarantee may not fundamentally change the commodification of work, right? Because essentially it provides an additional layer between unemployment benefits and jobs provided through the market in the economy. So Isabelle, you referred to the experimentation of job guarantees, such as the one in Austria that I'm involved in evaluating. And what we find is that the job guarantee works well for unemployed both on labor market outcomes. They find more employment, they get higher wages. They also feel better, also on the social side, so social inclusion, well-being. So I think all these things are credible. But they still prefer, those that can, to have a job in the market. Not everyone can find a job in the market, so for them it's really great. But so the job guarantee seems to be something in between the jobs provided through other means and being jobless. You had a prominent reference to the ILO Declaration of Philadelphia, signed at the end of World War II, which I think is very important, but already that declaration suffered from vague operationalization of goals. And when I worked for the ILO, there were big discussions how to operationalize these goals. And this leads me to suggest to use the ILO's pillars of decent work as a starting point. And the 4 pillars are employment, labor rights, social protection, and social dialogue. And these points are already a compromise by employers and employees. But I think from a progressive agenda, one could start with these 4 points and propose how to advance in each of the 4 areas by, for instance, achieving full employment, strong labor rights, universal and adequate social protection, and how to develop social dialogue in a way further to democratize work. Now, on democratize work, am I already running out? Good, thanks. On democratizing work, I think it sounds very appealing. The book proposes also a freedom of association of workers, equal representation of workers on boards with the management, as you referred to. And at the same time, these proposals are quite modest and already fulfilled with caveats, with limitation, as you said, in Germany, not fully, but to some extent. So in fact, I think one could argue that large parts of the economy are to some extent already democratized, even within our capitalist system now, or at least not fully subject to shareholder value, right? In Germany, the case of co-determination that I'm sure Anke will talk about, but also in other European countries with a strong history of state ownership of industries, such as in France and the Francophone world, or even the UK, the archetype of shareholder value in Europe, where the largest corporation, John Lewis, is in fact a cooperative owned by its employees, governed democratically by them, and that creates 2% of the entire GDP of the UK economy. The manifesto states that works council are still insufficient to create actual citizenship in firms, and I think we should take this realization in the manifesto as an opportunity to ask what additional avenues of democratizing work need to be pursued, perhaps besides or beyond workplace democracy. Is it only about democratizing firms or the economy more entirely? And how should the governance be structured? I mentioned some examples from different countries where state ownership, cooperatives, involvement of stakeholders or societal groups other than workers and firms. But I need to say, to qualify my point, keeping that vague may be intentional and strategic in the book to avoid overspecifying the goals that this movement pursues. The book speaks to a strength, and that is paths are made by walking, not by utopian planning of unrealistic ideas. So I think the book does a very good job in proposing things that are deemed right for creating this movement that it is. Finally, on decarbonizing, some countries in Western Europe or the Nordics or even Latin America achieve already several of the aspects of democratizing work and decommodifying work to some limited extent, perhaps not far enough, but to some extent already. But they are still not decarbonizing sufficiently. So that leads me to question the logic that decarbonization needs to follow from decommodification and democratization. And so the question to you is, what needs to be achieved to make sure that these 3 goals are linked and not pursued separately? Are the first 2 necessary conditions to achieve decarbonization? Are they sufficient conditions, or are they desired conditions to achieve decarbonization? And in that sense, to conclude, the book connects 3 other aspects. 3 other aspects, and that is it lays out an agenda for change. It lays out that change can be achieved through agitating, innovating, and orchestrating, as Julia Battilana calls the 3 types of people involved in collective movements for change, and that are different but equally needed 3 types. And the book itself does a wonderful job in all 3 types. The book itself, it agitates, it speaks out against the unjust. The book, it innovates, it proposes solutions that are both concrete and visionary, and it gives guideline for orchestration. it provides a roadmap for creating this movement that can lead to the implementation of the policies proposed and how to get there. It provides concrete steps forward, as I said, between long-term utopia and short-term policies. But often, it provides the often lacked mid-term strategy. And for that book, I want to congratulate you and the co-authors, and I'm very eager to see how this movement will unfold, and I hope it will be successful.
So thank you very much, Lukas, Lehner. And Isabelle, you will have understood that you will have the challenge to respond to a selection of some of these points, and then we'll move it over to some general contributions and other discussions. So next up on our critics panel is Anke Hassel from the Hertie School in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for asking me to comment on the book. And I would also like to recommend the book to everyone who hasn't read it yet or hasn't had a look at it yet, because it is worth reading, because it's challenging, it sort of gives new ideas, and it sets the goals on the agenda, which I absolutely agree with. So when we talk about democratize and decarbonize and decommodify, these are three goals I absolutely share. So I wouldn't, anything I say sort of later on, should not deflect from the fact that I absolutely agree with what you're trying to do and the themes you're setting with these books. Having said that, the impression I get from what you propose is that you're trying to do two things at once. And the two things are you're trying to empower workers. And there's a lot of emphasis on empowering workers and what that means. And at the same time, you want to change the system. And you somehow imply that these two things go together, and in a way, they are the same sort of thing. Yeah. And then you give very concrete measures on how to do that. And on the democratized work, you have a model in mind, how you do that, and you model it on the German co-determination model in the coal and steel industry. On the decommodification part, you have the employment scheme, universal employment scheme, which is, again, a very concrete measure, how you want to do it. On the decarbonization, you're not as concrete, but at least the first two things, you have a sort of very clear proposals. These are the things we should strive for, we should mobilize for. And when I have a disagreement with you, is really that I would say, I agree with the goals. I agree that we need to get moving on them and we should mobilize. I would not mobilize for these two concrete proposals. That is my criticism of the book and also of the manifesto when it was proposed 2 years ago. And when I first learned about it and I had my discussion with Lisa Herzog about the manifesto, this was in the context that I had just finished a report on workers' voice and workers' representation on company boards in Europe. And this report was based on an expert committee. In that expert committee, we had representatives of European trade unions, but also worker representatives at European companies, and other experts in the field, labor relations experts in the field. And we were sort of trying to figure out a way, how could we actually have a robust proposal in European policymaking for a European co-determination system? Because as you probably know, within the EU, there is a range of different regulations. And the different regulations range from no co-determination at all, which is almost in half of the European countries the case, and to the full-blown sort of German-style parity co-determination in steel and coal. Obviously, a lot of this diversity has to do with the politics in these countries, but it also has to do with the politics of the unions. Because if you talk to a Belgian trade unionist and you talk about co-determination, they think co-determination is an issue for traitors of the labor movements. Yeah, you actually try to undermine the labor movement if you propose co-determination workers on the board in a Belgian company. They are strictly against it. The same is true for the Italian trade unions. Italian trade unions don't want to get anywhere near co-determination in Italy. And it is a political point because they have wider political orientations and they say this is really collaborating with the system. We do not want to collaborate with the system, therefore we do not want to get involved in anything that companies do, so we don't want to take any responsibility for what the companies do. What we do is really opposition to the system, and this is very political. So if you are a part of that discourse, and if you try, even in the European context, even when you have sort of very social democratic orientations, when you talk about, with the unions, so if you, even in that context, you do not get an agreement on what co-determination should look like, it is very difficult to envisage that we have this one model, which is basically an extended German co-determination model, which we then sort of present to the world and say, you know, everywhere in the world, this is the system, we figured it out, we now have the perfect solution, this is how to democratize work. And because it's in an institutional approach. And as soon as you talk institutions within the European context, you have the Germans who say, we want to keep our institutions, they are the best institutions, this is what we want to do. You get the Nordics, who also have a co-determination system, which is much more flexible than the German ones, who say, we're actually quite happy with our system, we want to keep our institutions. And then you get the Italians and the Belgians who say, you know, we really don't want anything of that, we want to have sort of a full opposition against the capitalist classes. So my hunch is, you know, when we engage with sort of political debates, and there is practice on the ground, there are people who talk about this all the time. There are labor lawyers, lawyers who do corporate law and who battle with these issues. I think we should take them seriously, and we should take seriously what they say, because what they say is, however you regulate companies, it has to be rooted in your with your national systems and with the actors who have to actually live with it. Yeah. So, and then as soon as you do that, and that is then my second point. So the first point is really sort of take the research seriously, take seriously what's happening in the real world, how people talk about it, why they engage with it in very different ways. My second point is really, don't get hung up on concrete proposals and concrete institutions. Don't sort of design a system which is sort of German co-determination plus. You know, you have workers on the board, not only 50%, but, you know, they get veto right, and the president of the supervisory board cannot have a double vote anymore and cannot have the deciding vote anymore. Don't go near the institutions, really go to the process and think about, in each situation, think about what could be meaningful changes in the way we organize corporations and the stakeholders in corporations, that workers have a stronger role to play. And then you need to think about a rights-based approach, not an institution-based approach, but a rights-based approach where you could argue, if you wanted to, where you could argue what workers should have is a right to consultation, a right to participation, and maybe the individual worker could have a right to veto certain labor conditions, yeah? That you have to define labor conditions in a way that workers can actually have a meaningful say in saying, I will work under these conditions, but I can veto other conditions. But these are rights. And as soon as you think about rights, you think about agencies, and then you can have a lot of variations. It doesn't really matter how many workers are on the board of a firm. It doesn't really matter whether you have 50% or 51%, or maybe only one worker or two worker representatives on the board, if they have the right for particular rights to consultation, information, etc., but also certain transparency rights, yeah, that the board has to deliver certain information, has to be transparent, and that the workers can actually monitor the firm, the behavior of the firm, and then you get political leverage. So that would be sort of my key point. Think in terms of processes, think in terms of rights, and then give it to the actors that they can themselves decide this is how we want to use these rights. And the Belgian trade unions would use these rights very differently compared to the Italians, and you don't need this sort of institutional model. if we look at the German co-determination model, there is an irony here, because you have the strongest co-determination in the coal and steel industry. The coal and steel industry is where the unions have the most influence. But it's, if we put that in the context of decarbonization, this is obviously the opposite effect. What you get if you put workers on the board of a coal mine is not that they're in favor of decarbonization. Yeah? But what you get is, in Germany, a very prolonged and very slow process of decarbonization. And I'm absolutely convinced if the workers weren't on the board of coal mines in Germany, the process of decarbonization would be much faster than we have it today. And this is just a footnote, yeah. And a little bit of an irony that sort of within the same concept of democratization of work and decarbonization, we actually have a model which is not in favor of decarbonization, but which really makes the whole process very expensive, very costly. We subsidize coal mines for the next 20 years for a lot of money. And this helps some of the workers, but this is a tiny fraction of workers. These workers are already highly paid. They are male workers who we protect. And in terms of the constituency you have in mind, the female migrant worker working in domestic services, they are, light years away from that. So just think about it, sort of the message or the images you create using the German system of co-determination in the coal sector as a role model. I don't think it does you a favor. So I would really sort of consider whether it is good for you to use this as a model. So my final point is really about the politics and the agency, because I think you should focus on the agency and you should focus on the people who you actually working for. And what we have to take seriously is what workers actually want. And you only can engage them in mobilization if you really understand what they want and if you represent what they want. So if you want to represent work and if you want to democratize work, only very few people would answer for the question, what do you want? Only very few people would say, I want more workers on the board. Yeah, this is not a demand that ordinary workers have. Ordinary workers do want to be treated fairly, they want respect at work, they want a fair income, they want a stable employment relationship, the sort of bread and butter of their work. And we have to make a connection between that, what workers actually want and need, and that what you propose when you talk about democratize work, which is something very different. So I would really start by taking seriously what people need, what they want. How can we express this? What would be the process of putting that into the focus of the public policy debate? And a little bit in the pandemic, we already had that when we talked about workers who were very exposed to the pandemic in retail, but also in health services. And we have to focus on these issues and then give them the rights to say, I have a veto right because we cannot work under these conditions. That sort of thing I think you need to do. And my very, very final point is think also about the politics, because the politics, if you look at co-determination, workers on the board, these are, there's a hefty price to pay for that. And if you look at the history of co-determination in Germany, when was that possible? It was possible in a defeated Nazi Germany when everyone blamed the coal and steel industry for collaborating with the Nazis. That is when you get co-determination, when you want to punish the industry. Think about sort of, is that a realistic scenario when we can push these institutions further? I think you might sort of bet on the wrong horse if you look at that too much. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much to our third critic, Anke Hassel, and our fourth critic. And we do need to thank Virginia Doellgast, who was originally Life Events conspired to say, no, this was one panel too many for her. And it opened up the space here to not be too severe on the time. And all the panelists, thank you. And over to you, David Peetz from Griffith University in Australia.
Democratize, decommodify, decarbonise. Three great slogans, three great themes. Well, one great slogan, I suppose, although 13 syllables is a little bit long for a slogan. And I really think that Isabella's core idea of the bicameral firm really works greatly for democratisation of firms, of decommodification of labour. It's a brilliant idea, I like it a lot, and to all the thousands of social democratic politicians who are listening to us, just like Lukas said, very modest proposals. You can do it easily. Although I'm not actually sure they're listening to me. Unfortunately, I'm not really convinced that decarbonisation is at all well served by the idea of the bicameral firm, which is the sort of the linkage I want to talk about here. And in fact, I think the whole process of decarbonisation threatens the problems with achieving decarbonisation threaten democracy. Democracy is a lot more fragile than most of us realise, and that is a key problem. The central difficulty of the last 200 years has really been the inability of capitalism to account for externalities. Firms can emit poisons like carbon into the atmosphere without paying the social costs of that pollution. And the bicameral firm does not address that core sustainability problem caused by externalities. So Isabelle says that worker representatives are better attuned to the needs of the planet than corporate managers, and that's almost certainly true, but that is a low bar. And we shouldn't idealise workers on this issue. We still face a problem of externalities. Like Anke says, coal and aluminium workers aren't going to care much more about the planet than coal and aluminium companies do, and a union can only go so far in addressing action on climate. If it's membership and like the high-paid jobs that they get in those industries, and they are high-paid jobs. The difficult experience the Mining and Energy Union has faced in Australia is a good example of that. Now, in effect, Isabelle says we can address some of these problems through other mechanisms. One's the job guarantee, which we've heard a bit about, but unless we can guarantee very highly paid jobs, well, that's not going to be enough for these workers. Another external approach is to have effective environmental regulation. Well, yep, all for that. But let's not imagine that work is going to make the firm any more pro-environmental than it was unless the health and safety of the workers and their families of those living in the immediate area is threatened. And decreasingly that's the case, that people working near where they live. A structural solution is including community and consumer or government reps on the boards, on these bicameral boards. But this would dilute the workers' interests, and so it would weaken the industrial democratic potential of the bicameral system of the firm. And it would also mean that your environmental issues aren't getting much consideration themselves if they've only got one rep speaking on the board. It's better than none, but not really enough. So I guess all of those things would help, but really in a probably small way, and I'm worried that the problem's much bigger. I see democracy as being under fundamental threat from the climate crisis. And as much as I agree with the ideas that Isabelle's putting forward, I wonder that if we focus too single-mindedly on democracy in firms, we're going to lose the whole show. Now, we're not all going to die. Despite our hopes to the contrary, we're not going to have a green transition. We're going to have a series of major disruptions as policymakers basically realise that the path they've been taking us on isn't enough. And they've got to do a shed load more stuff. They've got to crank it up. That's going to cause a whole lot of disruptions, and this is going to happen repeatedly because each time they're going to crank it up, but they're not going to crank it up enough. And a few years later, we realise we're not getting anywhere near these climate goals. There's been another cyclone here. There's been another flood there. We've got to do more. It's going to be a series of disruptions. Now, that is, to use Isabelle's phrase, the political inevitability of the environmental crisis, a series of disruptions. And the more people put things off, and they're good at doing that, the bigger the disruptions are going to be. And it's going to happen repeatedly. Each disruption will create opportunities for the left, but also for the right. And unless there's going to be some really big changes, a small group of people will make a lot of money, the planet will become uninhabitable to most people, but not to all. We should never assume that the ultra-rich can't find a way to survive comfortably, be it in a bunker in the Waikato in North Island of New Zealand, or a gated or floating community on the Pacific Rim with its own private, heavily armed security. If the climate becomes so extreme, then it's plausible that under the influences of the ultra-wealthy, political processes would lead to some sort of fascist governments to rule society to protect those with great wealth and power. And that would be, obviously, the opposite of democracy. For those amongst the wealthy thinking of building bunkers or floating cities or whatever, well, the knowledge that they have a way out, well, it doesn't give them much incentive to do anything about preventing the rest of us from roasting. Now, the response of many on the left appears to be to advocate a degrowth path, but under present logics that would mean declining output, rising unemployment, or falls in incomes for those in employment, whether through a drop in hourly wages or a drop in hours worked. Unions would never support that outcome, nor would either house in a bicameral firm, neither would most citizens. And if a progressive government deliberately tried to induce negative growth, it would very likely be followed by a political response, ultimately of fascism. Again, the antithesis of democracy. And fascist governments, apart from suppressing meetings like this and any moves towards bicameralism in firms, would also ensure that capital was able to continue producing lots of carbon emissions. Negative economic growth would also doom workers from the global south to permanent poverty, I should add, and unremitting imperialism. So there's a major political question about how to garner the political constituency necessary to respond to the global environmental crisis. Part of it's about making use of the potential for common interests between unions and many environmental groups and parts of industrial and finance capital. Now, that might seem bizarre since the opening chapter, Julie's opening chapter, highlights the undemocratic nature of allowing decisions to be driven by finance, by money. Yet some of the critical money is workers' money. It's superannuation from Australia or pension funds from Europe or North America. And economic democracy isn't just about representation for workers' current incomes, it's about their future incomes as well. The state of the planet will shape how much that future income will be, and the use to which workers' capital is put will shape that planet. Now, the workers' pension funds, they're not the only parts of finance that can take a progressive line on climate matters. Others include the reinsurance companies and really a range of fund managers and asset owners that are linked to such entities as the International Investor Group on Climate Change. Just as financial markets will inevitably and probably soon price into their calculations the likely policy response on climate change, so too pension funds, insurance firms and many other parts of finance capital will increasingly orient their pricing behaviour towards a long-term horizon. And this increases opportunities for engagement with a broader constituency for action on climate change, including trade unions. So out of all that, the alternatives are grim, really. If greenhouse emissions continue on present trajectories, humanity won't kill the whole planet. and nor will all humans on Earth be killed, but the greatest casualty would probably be democracy itself. So, firm bicameralism? Yeah, well, I'll vote for that, but I can't say the odds of it happening are great. But I think the biggest problems aren't the difficulty of putting together a political coalition to make that happen, but the difficulty of preserving democracy itself. In its place may come a system worse than what anyone in this room has personally experienced, and it'll take a curious coalition to keep democracy going. In the past, when democracy has been introduced or saved, it's often involved many strange coalitions or alliances of groups acting together. Experiments, if you like. But those alliances have worked in the end. And there's no shortage of wealthy people who are only too happy to see democracy disappear. However, there's also no shortage of wealthy people who wish to avoid that, who we can make use of. So in promoting economic democracy, we can seek to change the formal decision-making processes, as per the bicameral firm, regardless of the composition of ownership of the firm, or we can seek to change the behaviour of the owners themselves by mobilising greater ownership by or on behalf of employees and forming purposeful alliances with other key owners, that is, mobilising financial power. Firm bicameralism changes the formal decision-making processes, but I think we need to think about changing the behaviour of the owners. Thanks, folks.
Now, Isabelle, you will need to respond to maybe 4 points. You can pick each criticism or you can cut them across. We won't have a lot of time given the 1+4 format, but there will be some time to make comments from the audience. And I remind you that you will be live streamed, okay? Because this is what's happening right now. Over to you, Isabelle.
Thank you.
Just a couple of the minor challenges.
Well,
if you can stop the gated floating communities on the Pacific with security guards, you could start there and then deal with fascism. Thank you.
Yeah. They were not the first on my mind, but thank you so much for the four of you for all these, the reading and the critical and constructive engagement with the book. Maybe I want to start with the issue of the role of researchers, because I think that it's important to say that this is a book that we wanted that we felt we had to write to nurture this conversation and as academic. And so if the book can help build a movement of raising awareness about these issues, we feel that it's a responsibility that we have, because indeed we are in the social sciences, most of the authors of the book, and we feel that we have a responsibility to speak to society and to provide for tools that can help society to understand itself better, maybe, and shed lights on the possible future that are before us. And so from that perspective, we feel that it's really our responsibility, and I think everyone can do that, whatever the specific topic that the person is researching. So the relationship with between the analysis, the proposals that are made, and then the engagement with society is not always easy to put properly, and I would like to quote Eric Colin Wright's vision here, which was about the role of the critical social sciences as trying to identify what could be what he called real utopias, that is, concrete proposals that can be put forth in the world as it works, but which will change the dynamic of the world in such a radical way that it will make room for the world as it should be, or as we would love to see the world being. That is, so the utopia. And this is the driving idea between these proposals. And so then it's very interesting, and it's typical. I'm always caught between reactions that say these proposals are like too weak, not radical enough, and other takes which says the very opposite, saying this is way too radical. This is actually never will be politically feasible. And you have to understand, I think that's illuminating when you think about these two types of reactions in the Eric Olin rights framework. Now, I would like on substance then to start with what Anke actually raised as a concern, which is the suggestion that we should start from taking seriously what workers express as demand. And here I would like to make very clear that I think all the authors in the book, and certainly myself in the work I've been doing, we really think that we anchor our work in the analysis that we've been able to do on workers' needs and expectation. Precisely, that's because work is what I've called a political experience, that is an experience of mobilizing one's own conception about justice in the workplace, basically every day, and be subjected to other norms that do not meet the workers' conceptions of justice, that actually workers voice or do not voice, but actually express in many different ways if you take the time to listen to them. And originally, my first field of expertise is sociology of work, is what I call the critical expectation of democratic justice. Workers do wait for democratic justice in the workplace. That is, they don't see why they should not have their say heard about how their work is organized, when they can go to the bathroom to take a break, when they're going to go to some training or not. Are they prevented to access a training? How are the profits divided? Obviously, that's a big pending question. All these questions, from what we might identify as small or big questions, all these questions mobilizes peoples deeply when they are having a job, and they do not have the ability to wait on these decisions for many of them. And so it's because of that very, what I call political experience, work being a political experience, that the philosophical principle actually that derives from that experience is the recognition of workers as citizens equal in dignity and rights in the workplace. That's the Article 1st of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And workers are not recognized as equals in the workplace. They have they have no right to bear on the government of the firm for many, or for most of the workers today, even though Lukas was very optimistic, I think, thinking that because we have in Germany some false parity, that the world actually looks like a somewhat democratized place. I think that's like counterfactually not consistent. But so if workers do have these expectations, and basically if firms are best understood as being political entities, that is, entities having economic characteristics, but governed alongside a division of power that prevents workers to bear on the government of the firm, then it is this political analysis lens that actually bring this urgency for this collective veto right for workers to bear on the decision. And why is it? Why this political principle, philosophical principle of the collective veto right, where does it come from? It does not come per se from German Mitbestimmung. It comes actually from the very long-term history of democracy. Since the 5th century before Christ in Rome, how we have managed to start the democratization of political entities governed by a despotic minority, it's through granting the other constituency this ability to collectively veto the decisions of the entity, which was in the hands of that whatever property-owning minority, like the patricians in Rome. And so it's indeed very interesting to see that in a very sub-specific case of the true parity Mitbestimmung case, the Mountain Mitbestimmung indeed, that is the case in the steel and coal industry in Germany, that you find that just for the nomination of the director of labor rights. But that's still a very, like the application of this principle is super small. But I find very, okay, 2 minutes. I think it's very, it's speaking very loudly to the history of the firm, that we find that same principle in the most advanced case of democratization of a despotic entity that we've seen in history, which has not been extended in the German case whatsoever so far. But so the idea here is indeed to recognize, and this is why we are speaking about democracy, that workers are citizens and they have not gained the right to be citizens in the workplace. And so it is really about understanding that. And I see as a very encouraging sign actually today that unions are understanding that more and more. For instance, the Italian version of the book as a preface from Maurizio Landini, who is the general secretary of the Segil, the main Italian union. What we see in the conversations we have with, indeed, Anke was mentioning that unions which are coming with a socialist background have been against German Mitbestimmung. Indeed, we can understand why, because it's false parity co-determination. So it's not a proper collective veto right. And so when we understand that we can go beyond what exists in Germany, which is not indeed the standard goal, it's actually a step in a long-term history of democratization, I think it makes much more sense, and it gives a sense of perspective also, because the collective veto right is not the end point in history. It's the full democratization of the economy, I think, which should be the goal. And so, to finish, two things. Just because obviously it's so important to realize that indeed democracy is in danger today, political democracy as we understand it. But I think one of the main reasons why political democracy is in danger is because we have not democratized our economy. So we have capitalism ruling the economy and basically being now in a position to cancel democracy in the police. So the key stake here is to mine for re-embedding the political entities that firms are, so economic entities, within the democratic architecture at the national level, the European level, the global level. And to do that, I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to think that if we democratize firms, they will have a much more beneficial relationship with states, because workers will be the citizens in the police that they are in the economy, and will be much more prone to accept that indeed we need general rules that apply to the entire economy vis-à-vis decarbonization, for instance. So I don't think that democratizing the firm will do the whole job for indeed the concern of decarbonizing and fitting within planetary boundaries, but the key problem here remains the proper embedding, if you want, of the firms into the political architecture, and for that, indeed, democratizing them is a key path forward. Yeah, I know I should stop. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Isabelle. I want to ask our critics if you have one thing that you want us to think about stemming from this session. You don't have to, but you're going to. Luca.
That's the difficulty to combine it all in once. Probably what I've been thinking in reaction to your comments, which I very much appreciate, are that we perhaps need to differentiate between strategy and analysis. And the book is trying to provide both. And we've had some controversial discussion, I think, about what is the right strategy. Should it be focused on proposals or on processes, for instance, on survival of democracy? My points of critique, for instance, focused more on the analysis, right? Is it consistent? And I think you've addressed that not every point that was made in the book was to come up with a fully fleshed out analysis, but in order more with a strategy, right, to achieve this change. And so that was my thinking, and I'll pass on.
So I take away from this session that is actually good to talk about utopian topics and new ideas, and which is not academic analysis, but it's not the purpose of the book to provide analysis. It's the purpose of the book to raise awareness and to mobilize people to think about these things, and it is very refreshing and good to do that. So I have a very positive feeling about this session.
I agree. We want to have we want to create a forest of democracy, but actually it's a very fragile flower.
So my main takeaway of this session is it's great to have these interdisciplinary discussions, because in my perspective, the 3 principles that are laid out in there, just to build on what you said, were really what we think of a right-based approach. And so for me, democratization, decarbonization, decommodification is what we have to think of as a rights-based approach, and it's the pathway to really get there, starting from maybe more of a reform perspective, leading on to more radical changes. Thank you.
So thank you so much to our 4 critics, as well as to the co-agitators, the co-innovators, the co-orchestrators, and the co-conspirators of Democratize work. It's been a great session. Our Network K sessions will continue tomorrow morning, but at the Casa Hotel, which is a couple of kilometers south from here. So have a great evening, and thank you so much, all of you.